Today I'm going to show you some Unreal Engine 5 lighting tips, tricks, etc. Basically how I would light a portrait. So I have this Unreal Engine 5 scene here, and I have no lights in my scene. And typically what most people do is they'll go up to their window, they'll go up to the environment light mixer, and they'll just click everything, and now we have this gross, horrifying looking thing. And sure, we could go in and adjust our directional light. We can clear our search bar and maybe try and get the directional light to give us the look we want. But in general, I always find that this basic setup won't give me the exact look that I need for stills. If you're making a game, sure, all these tools will be helpful for outdoor environments, but when it comes to lighting something to make it feel like the human eye is going to see it in like a movie or photography, etc., I will actually start with something much simpler. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the directional light, delete the fog, delete the sky atmosphere, and delete the volumetric cloud. We're going to just keep a skylight here. And the reason why we have a skylight is that's going to create our ambient light. Like basically thinking about in this room, if I turn off my main light, what is just the ambient light of the room? I have my windows blacked out, but if you didn't have that, you just have some spill of light. Now, if you're doing more portrait photography with flashes, then you would want to have really strong lights, and that doesn't really matter. But we're going to think about this like filmmakers, so we're going to have more consistent lighting. What that means is that we're going to use the skylight and we're going to use an HDRI. So we're going to go into our skylight here. We're going to uncheck real-time capture. And then we're going to go and set the source type to a specified cube map. And then we're going to go to our content browser, and I have a folder here for some HDRIs. Now, you can get HDRIs from Polyhaven or some other thing online. I do use the service Grayscale Gorilla. They have a lot of HDRIs for more like professional stuff, and in general, when it comes to shooting portrait photography, you typically have venues or specific places that cater to a more professional look, and GSG just happens to have some of that stuff. And with my background in shooting portrait photography, I'm just going to use that. So we have this venue here. It looks kind of like an empty sort of space, and referring back to the ambient light that I was mentioning, imagine we're just in this space here and we're trying to create some sort of portrait with this. So this is basically going to be our ambient light. This looks like this looks gross, and the reason why is the lighting just doesn't really feel flattering on her. Her eyes look very dead, and the reason why is there's no extra lighting to help create shadow and depth on our character here. Now, when it comes to trying to create a good-looking still in Unreal, every artist is going to say the same thing: get reference. So some of the best places I've found for reference are going to be shotdeck.com. This is a paid service. I do have an account with them. I'm not sponsored, but I highly recommend it. And it's basically a database of images from movies that you can use to help create lighting reference, composition reference, etc. So in the search bar here, I just searched up catchlight, and a catchlight is basically like the little glistening light that you see in an eyeball whenever you look at a movie. Most movies have this. Let's go ahead and just click on this image right here. And if you look very closely, there's this little tiny spot right there that really creates that like life inside this character. Let's go ahead and find one more as an example. This is more of like an outdoor scene. It's indoor, but it's more evenly lit, but you can still see a lot of the reflections in the eye, and it helps drag attention to this being the most important part of the image. Most humans will just look at an eye. So okay, get reference. That means we need to add some lights to our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my selection mode, make sure that I'm here, and then we can either use this menu, the quickly add to projects menu, and just find a light, or we can use our place actors panel. I'm just going to do it this way because this is how I like to do it. Let's go ahead and drag a directional light or rectangular light into our scene, and let's go ahead and center that out into world center. Now I'm going to go back to my sequencer, and I'm going to click on this blue icon to leave my camera, and now holding right click WASD, we can move our rectangular light to be in a spot. Now, if you're familiar with typical lighting, 3-point light setups will typically have the first key light, the main light, on camera right. So let's go ahead and take this. Now, I don't see my lighting preview, so I'll just select my light and hit G. Make sure I'm select my viewport and then hit G, so then we can see where this light is pointing. And I'm going to go ahead and position this to be up and a little bit higher, slightly over to the right, camera right. And let's just turn this towards our character. Now, if you hit Shift C on the keyboard, we can switch between our camera view and our overall world view, and we can see here that we have now that catch light. The light is definitely way more intense here, but we can obviously just bring this down to like a 0.5. And now we have something that definitely looks a lot more flattering, because it looks a little bit more lifelike because that one light. Now, one of the biggest peeves I have about the 3-point lighting setup is that it's almost a cliche. Sometimes when you're doing like documentary style filmmaking, you only have one light. That's all you can really do, and you can do a lot with one light. So again, going back to the whole reference thing, one photographer I do highly recommend checking out, his name is Manny Ortiz, and he has a lot of content on YouTube about portrait photography, and a lot of his content does focus on using one light setups, so that can be helpful. And one of my favorite photographers that I learned from is Daniel Norton, and we can see here that a lot of his portrait photography is very it really emphasizes lighting, and we can see here that this catch light for this portrait is super strong, and that background is very soft and evenly lit. So the highest point of contrast is going to be the eye of the character, of the person, followed by the face, and the rest of the contrast, the darker parts of the image pull us away, so we can make sure we're looking at the main part that is actually the most exciting. Okay, so let's go back to Unreal really quick. Like I said, reference is important. This still looks a little flat to my eye, so we can do a couple things. First off, I'm going to go ahead and leave my camera, and I'm going to first look at the shadow. Now, what I'm looking for here is just like how intense the shadow is. Now, with Unreal, because it's CG and digital, one of the things that I will always do for a lot of my higher quality productions is I will go into my rectangular light and go to search and type in ray, and we're going to turn on cast ray trace shadows. Now, to make this more prominent, I'm just going to go ahead and increase my intensity just a little bit, and let's go ahead and look at the shadow right here in particular, and I will type in ray and set the cast ray traced shadows to enabled. Now look at the shadow. It's going to get much softer and much cleaner, and this will really help with cleaning up some shadows in gross areas. So I'll hit Shift C again to look through my main camera, and I will set this intensity back to like 1. Maybe 1.5, just a little bit brighter there. And that gives us a nice little Rembrandt lighting. Maybe I'll take the Z value, and this will bring the light upwards just a little bit. We can see we get that stereotypical triangle around this one spot, and we have that catch light there. Now, one thing that's important to remember is the size of your light. The size of your light is important because the bigger the light, the softer the light will be. If you look at the sun, when you look straight up in the sky on a blue sky day, it's going to give you some really harsh shadows. If I set this source width to like 5 and 5, we can see that shadow gets much harder. If I set the source width to like 1 and 1, it's going to be a very harsh light, and if I just crank that up, that looks a lot more intense. Versus if I go ahead and increase my source width to like let's say 300, roughly 300, now we're getting a much softer light based on this the size of the light. And if I hit Shift C, I can go ahead and leave and hit G on my keyboard. You can see how large that light source is. So when I have a bigger light, I will have a softer light. So I'm going to set this back to something a little bit more normal. If we go back to the reference of, let's say, this photographer, Manny Ortiz, we can see that this light source, this beauty dish, a modifier, it's not much larger than, it's about maybe 1.5 times the size of his torso, I guess. I don't know. I'm sure there's equalized and standardized sizes for those things, but I'll set this source width to like 100 and 100 for now, and that's going to give us a little bit of a shadow there. And now I can decrease that intensity to something that's a little bit more flattering. Let's just say 2. Okay, cool. Now from here, for our lighting, because we are working in CG, we can get a little bit creative. We have this attenuation radius, and that's basically going to say how far the light will affect. So if I increase this or decrease, we can say only affect a certain distance in our shot. Now, we can see here that if I turn off my skylight here, this rectangular light is really adding a lot of drama and contrast. And what I like about CG is we could very easily go into our skylight and decrease the intensity. So we can go ahead and set this intensity scale to like 0.5, and that's going to really reduce our ambient light intensity and really help us compose and paint light into our image. Now, when it comes to lighting in Unreal, it's also very important to have one thing. Now, I'm going to go up to my quickly add to project menu, and I'm going to type in post process volume. I'm going to drop this into my scene. Now, from here, what we need to do is set the infinite extend on bound, the UNB in the search bar right here, set this to on. So now our post-process volume is going to affect all of our scene. And we're going to go to our exposure tab, and we're going to turn on our metering mode, exposure compensation, and our min and max. Now from here, we're going to set this to 1 and 1, and this will basically lock our exposure. It's as if we're shooting on a real camera here. And because of that, now our light is really going to be controlled by the lights itself, not our camera trying to decide the lighting for us. So I'm going to set my intensity scale to my skylight to 1 to bring it up just a little bit. And now from here, I'm going to go ahead and add a second light and try and lean into that, I guess, 3-point lighting setup. So what I'll always do here is I will go to my rectangular light here. I will hit F2 on the keyboard to rename it. I'll call this light underscore key. Now, from here, I will duplicate that with Control D, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit Shift C on the keyboard to leave my camera, and hit W to move this light, and I'm going to position this to be just a little bit lower, like so. And I can switch between my world space by hitting Control tilde and my local space. So Control tilde, the little squiggly next to the 1 key on your keyboard, will allow you to change the axis in which you orient your light. Now, I'm going to hit Shift C just to see where this light is and see what that's doing. All right, that's giving me a nice fill. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit F2 on the second light, and I'll call this fill. Now, we're losing a lot of that shadow and drama and contrast of our shot. Now, it really depends on the look that you're going for, but I want something a little bit more contrasty. So in the fill, I'm going to first set this to 0, just to see where my starting point is at. And now I'll just eke this up just barely. Let's say like 0.2. 0.3, just enough to create a little bit of extra fill in that space. Now, a typical photographer may do something like add a bounce card or a white card or something to help create that fill naturally, but I found that relying on bounce light, do you mind, Los Angeles? But I've generally found that relying on bounce light in Unreal will create a lot of unnecessary artifacts, and because we don't have to spend thousands of dollars for adding extra lights in Unreal, let's just go ahead and add an extra light. So we have our fill light here. I'll keep it at 0.3, and that looks pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the width and height to like 20 and 20, and I might just have to adjust the intensity just a little bit more, just so that we can make sure that we're affecting the shadows as we want them to. So I am still getting a little bit of extra highlight around this one little spot that's giving us that Rembrandt lighting. And if we didn't like that, we can go ahead and either increase the key light intensity. Let's set this to like 3. And now we get a little bit more intensity there. Or we could go ahead and decrease the intensity of our fill to like 0.2, 0.1, or just turn it off entirely. It really depends on the look that you're going for. Now let's add one more light going off of that typical 3-point lighting setup. And again, this is referencing Daniel Norton. A lot of his style does use a lot of 3-point lighting, and you can kind of pick that up here. We have our main key light that's going to be camera right here, and we can see with this light here, we're still getting a little bit of that Rembrandt lighting, but we're getting a little bit of extra highlight on her hair on the left side of the frame. And if I had to guess, it's likely because he has some sort of rim light in this shot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this key light, and let's go ahead and rename it and call this rim. And from here, I will go ahead and hit Shift-C on my keyboard. Let's go ahead and leave. And for some reason, sometimes the camera will do a little funky thing where it won't let you look at from a wider perspective. So I would just go to my perspective view, so switch this to cinematic, and there we go. Now we're using that wide standard Unreal viewport view. Let's go ahead and move this rim light now. I'm going to go ahead and move this to the back of my character and give us a nice little rim over here, and I can just go ahead and preview that by hitting Shift-C and turn that on and off, and that's going to add that extra hair light. Now I want to bring this down, so the Z value, the blue value, will bring the, if I bring this more towards a lower number, it'll bring it lower in space, and then I'm going to bring this further back, so I will bring my Y value, the green or yellow, colorblind, that value into a more negative number. So I'll select my light and hit W and just move this to a spot that gives me what I want, and now I will hit Control tilde and really just try and get that light into a position that I like. And I think I like that right there. Now, with Unreal and hair and a lot of extra CG things that happen on the back end, it's not going to look as perfect as, let's say, a real photo. Hair is hard. Hair is really hard. So we're not going to talk about the hair right now. But from a lighting standpoint, we're just trying to get the principle across. I'm pretty cool with this shot. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my source width and height to a much lower number. I'll set this like 20 and 20, and that's going to add a really intense light in our background, and I will maybe increase that just a little bit. Now you can definitely go overboard, and this looks like this is now the highest point of contrast, this bright light, and it looks worse because really we want the face to really stand out as the most important part of the image, and this rim light is getting way too hairy. So just for example's sake, don't set your rim light too high, but it helps create a little bit of extra balance in our image. So I'll set this to like 1, 2, and yeah, I'm okay with that for now. Okay, we're going to go through one more thing that I always do with a lot of my lighting setups in Unreal, or just any CG shot in general, and that is how lighting is rendered in CG. So a light typically in Unreal or Blender or Cinema 4D, etc., is just going to be a big rectangular or square white box, and you can go ahead and change the light color, you can go ahead and increase the intensity, but my biggest issue with lighting in CG is that it takes away from a lot of the I guess sort of realness to it. So I'm going to give you an example. Hi, we're looking at hello. We're doing the thing, and I want you to look at this big light right here. So this light is my key light for my office setup, and if you look at it here, it is not just a purely white circle. There is parts of the image that are brighter and parts of the image that are darker. It's just the way natural world lighting works. So with that in mind, so with my big light up here, I use that as my reference point to like say, hey, how should my light actually be affecting my scene? Now you can do this in a couple ways. You can go to Photoshop and just make a circle or a sphere and add some sort of like gross, dirty map or noise or something to help create those like little splotches of brightness and darkness. I'm lazy. I have this image here for a grid, and this is typically something that you would use for lighting. And this grid here would be used to reduce the amount of spill for a light. You basically making the light more directional. So I'm going to go ahead and take this texture and go into my key light and drop this on. Now we're definitely losing a lot of intensity here because if you remember the light that I mentioned before I added this texture in the source texture of my light, it's just a pure white square. Versus this is not a pure white square. It's looking at the brightest values and is going to only light based on the brightest and darkest parts of this image here. So I will typically go into a lot of my lights and just add some sort of extra texture to help create some more depth in that shot. And that will affect reflections. That will affect a lot of different aspects of the way the light works in your CG shot. So I would just go ahead and drop that in and really create that nice soft lighting using some sort of image in my light. Okay. That was the last thing. Let's go ahead and render this shot. So what I'm going to do is go to my sequencer here, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on my movie render queue with that button, the clapboard. And I just have my level sequence. It's today's date, and I'm going to use one of my render presets. If you want to use my render presets, link in the description down below. It is free, I promise. All right. So I'm just going to use this guy. It is going to give us a baseline, and let's go ahead and save this somewhere on our computer. Go into our render settings, output, and portrait lighting demo. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning about MetaHuman, just a quick pro tip, if you set your temporal count to anything other than 8, it's going to be really unhappy. Just be warned, the hair will break. So just acknowledge that. Last thing I will do is, because this is a still, I'm going to go into my post-process volume over here, and I'm going to type in motion blur, and I'm going to turn everything on and then turn it all off by setting every value to 0. So now there will be no motion blur, and the reason why I'm doing that is because this is actually a motion test pose that I was doing, but we just found a nice frame that worked for this character. Okay. So no motion blur on. Let's go ahead and hit the render local button, and it's going to load up our thing. And now we have our warm-up frames going, and the hair is doing a freak out, and it probably did a freak out. So it did a freak out. It actually looks terrible, but the reason why that's happening is because there's actual animation on this, and it's making the hair do a thing. So what I'm going to do just really quick is go to my character, go to animation, right click, go to body plus control, nope, body, bake to control rig, bake to this control rig. And we're basically saying, hey, let's go ahead and bake this animation to this character. And then we're going to go into the control rig and look at all these keyframes and realize that we don't need all this stuff. So let's just scroll and delete. Delete. So now we just have our main pose, and there should be no animation. Let's go ahead and hit G. That's a pretty good looking shot. Hit the render button, render local, and now it's doing the warm-up frames, and now it's rendering those 4 frames that we had from our level sequence. Go ahead and hit the preview button, and now we have a beautifully rendered lit shot. Obviously we could do something with the hair, but what I hope you learned from this video is some lighting tips in Unreal, how to approach it from a cinematographer and a photographer standpoint. If you learned something, let me know in the comment section down below. Questions, comments, concerns, whatever else. Comment section is down there for that as well. And I will leave you with the final tip, as always: 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. Goodbye, my friends. Bye.